Hi class, and welcome to this video for Year 12 VCE Economics. We're focusing on Unit 3, Outcome 3, and we're looking at the final key knowledge point, which is all about trade liberalisation. What do I hope that you get out of this video? Firstly, you understand what we mean by trade liberalisation, and then we're going to consider the trends of this and how that has impacted Australia's international competitiveness, our goals, strong and sustainable GDP, full employment, low inflation, so price stability, and how it's going to impact our living standards. So the first question is, for some of you might not have heard this term before, what do I mean by trade liberalisation? Here we are talking about the concept of trade between nations. Many nations trade, and trade liberalisation can be defined as any initiative that has been designed to promote what we call free trade. And when we say free trade, we are doing trade where the restrictions have been reduced, or we have removed or reduced the barriers to free trade of other countries. So trade liberalisation is essentially policies that have been implemented to allow trade between countries to be easier. Because you might not have known, or might be surprised to know, many countries actually put a lot of restrictions or barriers for trade because they want to protect industries within their country. They don't want to be competing with other countries that potentially make the good or service better than them, so cheaper or higher quality, so they put restrictions. In its purest form, and you might have heard this term before, free trade means that countries can trade goods or services with another country in the absence of protections, so no trade barriers at all. So that doesn't always happen, and we'll talk about what these barriers could be in a second, but free trade means that countries will agree to trade without any restrictions. In general, trade liberalisation has been increasing. The restrictions have been removed, and there is more and more trade than ever before between countries. This is because countries have accepted the benefits of liberalised trade between economies, although there are often losers in this within economies. So it's not saying it's perfect, but in general, we are removing a lot of the restrictions. So what is Australia's policy? Australia used to be what we called a protectionist. And by that we meant we put a lot of barriers to trade because we wanted to protect industries in our country that were particularly important. But since the 1990s, we have started to adopt the policy of trade liberalisation and are looking at reducing the protections on our local industries. We're trying to remove the protections on our local industries, and this then creates an environment where there is more trade happening. So before we look at the trends, how can you be a protectionist? How can you put in policies that mean you're trying to protect your local industries and reduce the trade? You might put a tariff, and this is where there is a tax on imports into your country. So a tariff might be, for example, anytime another country is trying to bring goods into your country to sell and compete against your local industries, they must pay a tax on that. Other way that you protect local industries is you actually put subsidies and assistance via the government into your local industries to make them more competitive. So for example, you might provide cheap water or power to an industry so they can compete internationally. But this makes it harder to trade. You might abolish import quotas, where you put a limit of how much a good can be imported into your country. These are the many ways that Australia used to be a protectionist and how other countries are protectionist now. What you are seeing in terms of Australia's policy, we are moving away from that. We are moving to a focus of trying to have lots of trade without restrictions. And we are increasing our free trade agreements. You can see all the way up to 2000, we only actually had one free trade agreement. But by 2015 and 16, we had 10, and we have even more now. We used to have a significant amount of tariffs. In 1970, 36% of imports were subjected to a tariff. Now only 5%. And that was from manufacturing. Agricultural tariffs, we used to have 28% of imports of agricultural goods coming into Australia being subject to a tariff. Now there is 0. So you can see there is a significant shift towards being embracing global trade. And we are not subsidizing to the tune anywhere near amount as much our local industries. So in this case, we are creating an environment in Australia to embrace free trade. Now that means some of our local industries are going to be having some issues because they are now competing against other countries' imports. So our imports from other countries at a disadvantage or without that protection, but there are real advantages to this. So what is the effect of trade liberalisation on our competitiveness? When a government embraces this and lowers tariffs, reduces subsidies, abolishes quotas, negotiates free trade agreements, we start to see some impacts. Firstly, there is increased competition for local businesses. They must now compete with imports of goods or services from other countries. But this potentially forces them to lower their prices and forces them to become more competitive in terms of their quality. It allows Australian firms to specialise their production in areas where we have a cost advantage, because we are now going to be able to sell our goods overseas without those similar restrictions. So if we find an area Australia has an advantage, we make lots of that good or service, and now we have a whole world to sell it to. This allows firms, local firms, to gain economies of scale and forces firms who are now competing with other internationally competitive countries, forces them to restructure their operations, lift their efficiency and cut their production costs, or otherwise they're not going to survive. And this does theoretically make for a more competitive, efficient nation. It allows local businesses to gain access to latest technology around the world because we can now trade and get that information and that technology. And importantly, encourages businesses to think creatively, to provide services that meets the needs more effectively, because they can't rely on the protection of a government via tariffs and subsidies. So they must stand on their 2 feet and compete internationally. So there is a lot of impacts, and there can be some losers for those that aren't willing to become more efficient or are unable to. But in short, it should make a country that is more competitive if they embrace trade. So what's the impact on some of our goals? In short, trade liberalisation has theoretically going to result in lower inflation. Why? Trade liberalisation causes resources to be used more efficiently and productively. And this should reduce the costs and prices and allow us to have more of a chance of meeting our RBA goal of low inflation or price stability. Trade liberalisation, especially the free trade agreements which are increasing, has grown our access to larger markets abroad, allowing our local businesses to have economy of scale, cutting their fixed costs. And it also has allowed local businesses to have access to cheaper input costs, such as equipment and technology and raw materials, because there are no tariffs or quotas on it coming in. So the local business can get those inputs cheaper. So what is the impact? And I must admit, I don't know where I got this data from, but I do know it's accurate. The average inflation rate before significant trade liberalisation, so roughly 1990, was 9.3%. So significant. Ever since, it's been within the RBA band. Now, of course, there are significant other factors that have influenced inflation, but you can see a potential benefit or potential evidence of this benefit. What is the impact of trade liberalisation on growth? Sorry, and I will come back really quickly. If we want to just make a summary, increased trade liberalisation policies should result in lower inflation. And as it goes, if it was reduced or we went back, our inflation would theoretically go up higher. In terms of the impact of trade liberalisation on our growth, where we want to be strong and sustainable, so as high as we can without having inflationary pressures, typically it is thought that increased trade liberalisation increases growth. So it is thought as trade liberalisation has increased, growth or GDP has also increased. Why is that? Trade liberalisation has allowed for greater specialisation because we have access to bigger markets. And this has allowed for efficient allocation of resources involving lower opportunity costs. This means we can have more outputs with the same amount of inputs, increasing our productivity capacity, increasing our GDP. Because we can focus on the things that we do well, because the other things that we can't do as well, we can trade for. This is trade liberalisation, as we have talked about, has allowed local businesses to access their equipment and materials and technology at a lower cost. This is favourable aggregate supply conditions, increasing our GDP. And importantly, trade liberalisation has grown the size of our export market, increasing sales, increasing our aggregate demand, and increasing our GDP. And the evidence for that is, as I pointed out in the previous slide, our GDP, when we didn't have significant trade liberalisation, was around 1.4% per annum. Since we've adopted trade liberalisation approach, our GDP has increased to 1.8% per annum. So what's the impact on employment? By boosting all this efficiency and all these good benefits from trade liberalisation, theoretically our businesses have become more competitive, and this should allow us to be more productive, have greater GDP, more positive aggregate demand factors, and should theoretically keep our employment lower and have good conditions in a labour market. It's allowed us to reduce our costs. Reducing costs allows us to potentially expand and employ others. So there is theoretically what you should see as trade liberalisation has increased, the greater achievement of full employment goals or a lower unemployment rate. How does it impact benefit? How does it impact living standards? You can see that there are some benefits and some costs, and it will all depend on where you stand, in what industry you are working on. Trade liberalisation has improved the economic well-being of many in Australia. And you can see the many reasons why here. And this has led to improved living standards, greater growth, lower prices, greater efficiency in resources, improved consumer choice, improved cooperation, greater stability. All of these things should improve material and non-material living standards. But it should be noted that for some people in Australia, their living standards have gone down because of trade liberalisation. There is higher structural unemployment, and there has definitely been some losers because of trade and free trade. Many of our industries have become uncompetitive as we are now competing with more nations. And some have just not been able to compete, have never had a chance. And these are, for example, our manufacturing, our car industry, for example, has been relocated, restructured, or closed down. Now, this can lead to higher structural unemployment because many of those people just don't have the skills or feel like they don't have the skills to find employment in other places. This impacts their material living standards, but importantly, their non-material living standards. Because you have essentially felt like you had a job for life, you are living in an industry, working in an industry that gave you feelings of self-worth, and it's been taken away because you're instantly non-competitive. So it does definitely have some benefits and some costs. In short though, I hope this video has helped you understand trade liberalisation, which are policies that encourage trade between nations and is the removal of those restrictions like tariffs, subsidies and quotas. And on a whole, it should have significant benefits to a nation, and Australia has seen many of those benefits. It has improved our living standards. But as we note, as we trade more, as we compete, there will be specific losers, and this can create some structural issues within an economy.